So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about preventing food waste and what happens before it actually ends up in the compost pile. And as I'm going through, if you guys have any questions, definitely just sort of raise your hand and we can take a step back and stop. So Maria mentioned some of this, but generally speaking, we waste a lot of food. And I think we waste a lot more food than people realize. The latest number that has been reported globally is that we waste about 40% of our food. And this is across farms, restaurants, grocery stores. I know, it's so crazy, right, Eden? It's horrible. Now, this is obviously, the interesting thing about the food waste problem is that it sort of crosses all bounds, meaning it's very hard to make this a political issue, which oftentimes gets wrapped up in climate change and other environmental issues, because food waste it's an economic problem, as Marie mentioned. It's a lot of wasted money. The food that you buy that you don't end up using, it's money that you spent that ends up going in the trash. It's resources that are spent by farmers to actually grow the food, and then, as Maria mentioned, there's tipping fees. So when something goes in the trash, it doesn't just sort of disappear into thin air. Somebody pays to dispose of that food. So one, it's a lot of wasted money across the chain. The second is that it's a social justice issue, right? 1 in 8 Americans are going hungry in this country. But if we're wasting 40% of our food, there's a mismatch, right? There is food and it's not getting to the right place and the right person. So we do need to figure out how to make sure the food is getting to the right person in the right place, because we have a lot of people that are actually going hungry, and it's not because there isn't enough, it's because it's not getting in the right hands. And then the third issue that is indeed an environmental issue, and I think Maria did a great job of explaining this idea that when we put food in the landfill, it creates methane. When you have too much methane, it traps all the heat and then, leads to all the problems around climate change. So, so for that reason, thinking about food waste and understanding it has a lot of benefits, even if we make some really interesting and small changes. Now, a lot of people think that, oh my goodness, there's a lot of food getting wasted, we should go to the farm and we should find all those tomatoes that are just sitting and rotting. And that's definitely an important issue, but actually the misconception is that, the myth is that it's happening at the farm or it's happening where we don't see it, but what's really happening is that the end user, the consumer, us, are the biggest culprits of causing food waste. So this is an example from Canada, and this is pretty much similar to what's happening in the US, that 47% of food waste and the impact of it is caused by the consumer. And then the rest of it is caused by people who touch the consumer, so restaurants and grocery stores, right? So if we think about what that actually means, that means us buying something that we don't end up using and putting it in the trash. That means a grocery store supplying tomatoes and zucchini and cucumbers that somebody looks at and picks up and says, ooh, this cucumber is dented, I'm not gonna buy it, I'm gonna put it back on the shelf. Or it means a restaurant who cooks a lot of food or prepares a lot of food and then doesn't get the same customers that they were expecting, and then they end up throwing it in the trash. And so this idea of food waste being a kind of issue that's far away is wrong. It's actually very much in our wheelhouse, it's in our homes, it's based on our day-to-day decisions. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity that each one of us has to really make some changes on a daily basis. When we're thinking about the environmental impact of food, obviously not everything is the same, and the environmental impact of food waste really ladders back up to the environmental impact of producing that food. So when you look at this chart, and it's sort of hard to see, but what you'll see there is that the animal products are very high up on the list because they're very resource intensive to produce. Beef is the biggest one. Beef, cheese, farm-raised fish, pork, chicken, eggs are the top. And then as you go down, the environmental impact of these foods kind of falls because these are less resource intensive foods to produce, right? Because if you're thinking about beef production, you don't just have to raise the cow, you have to feed the cow. So you have to grow stuff to feed the cow, which then, so in terms of the environmental impact of that food, it's a lot going in. So if you buy a hamburger patty that you don't end up using, it's a big carbon footprint, right, that we're throwing away. Now, as I mentioned, there's a few different things that we can do to try to mitigate food waste. So I'm going to talk about, you'll see up at the top left corner, reduce, reuse, recycle. We're going to talk about ways to reduce your food waste, the ways to reuse stuff that might have gone in the trash, and then finally recycle, but I know we're going to cover a little bit about that. So the first point I want to make is about seconds. Does anybody know what seconds are? Does that sound familiar?
Leftovers?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So seconds are actually a technical term where at a farm or at a grocery store, you'll have produce that don't meet spec. So at a grocery store, if you've ever seen tomatoes or cucumbers or zucchini, everything looks like great and pretty much the same, and that's because the grocery store has certain specs that they need to maintain, right? Cucumber needs to be this long, it can't be curved, and so what happens is that there are a lot of things that don't meet spec that don't end up at the grocery store. Now, seconds are if you ever, I think the Royal Oak Farmers Market had these yesterday, a lot of the farmers will have a table labeled seconds, right? There are tomatoes that are a little mushy, cucumbers that are a little dented, things like that. What we can do is actually buy those, right? That's one of the best things to do is rescue that food. And as much as a dented tomato tastes just as good as a undented tomato, it's actually cheaper. The farmers will sell that to you at a discount. Some of them will just give it to you for free. So when you're at the grocery store, ask if they have seconds in the back. Some of them do. And then if you're at the farmer's market, ask the farmers for their second supply. They'll gladly offload it to you because they don't want to see it going to waste either. The second thing we can do is understand date labels. Now, date labels are actually very confusing. If you've ever seen your eggs or your milk or anything, or your yogurt containers, they'll say things like, best by so-and-so, sell by so-and-so. Now, the issue is that most of these dates are actually not regulated. It's the manufacturer decides that they're going to put some date on it to help them sell product, but it doesn't actually indicate safety. Now, that causes some problems, right? Because if you don't know what's definitely safe, you assume it's not safe and then you throw it away. But there are some general rules of thumb that you can implement. And I think it all really boils down to trusting your nose. And this is sort of going back to how my mom taught me how to see if milk was good or not. With milk, you know, obviously because of pasteurization in the US, it's actually safe for much longer after. I know it's much longer after the date. So really trusting the smell is the best way to figure out if it's still good. With eggs, how many of you have seen the float test? Does anybody know the float test? Okay, so a few of you. So I'll explain the float test. To know if an egg is good or bad, you take a cup of water and you drop the raw egg, the egg in the shell, into the cup of water. If it sinks, it's good. If it floats, it's not good. So eggs are using the float test. And then with yogurt's another easy one where it usually lasts about 1 to 3 weeks after the actual date. And once it's open, it takes about a week. But it's good for about a week once it's been open. So learn about date labels and don't be so upset if it goes past. Yeah.
Talking about date labels,
yes.
Expiration dates, is like talking about religion and politics.
Oh yeah.
That just don't get it.
Yeah.
But the government or somebody has ingrained, especially in millennials and the likes of that, that date means chalk it.
Yeah.
And to try to state the case for that is just such a chore with people. It's because I really thought the government did that.
No,
it's manufacturers that you say
covering their butts, which is appropriate,
true,
right?
Right,
like
for product liability and all
totally,
of that type. So I come from that arena, so I can understand that. But that is such a difficult thing to get
now
over.
There has been some legislation proposed last year. If you guys have heard of the chef Tom Colicchio, who's on Top Chef, he was actually one of the main supporters of basically figuring out how to provide some regulation around date labeling, but it hasn't really gone. The date labels that you see on your packages are not reflective of any progress on legislation. So if this is something you guys care about, like write to your senators, write to your congresspeople. Debbie Stabenow definitely is very aware of this issue because her relationship with the Farm Bill. But yeah, there should be regulation and there isn't. That's basically kind of where things stand right now.
I was going to interject too that I work in the arena for my profession of organizing and estate liquidation and so forth. And when I donate food, because that's an option sometimes, the entities of Forgotten Harvest, blah, 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 and other, you correct me if I'm wrong, they will take food that is 1 year past.
Yeah.
That's their...
For packaged.
Right? Packaged.
For most things, because there's certain shelf life. So for canned goods, for example, I think canned typically are fresh 1 year after that date, but not everything. Yeah.
Exactly right. For anything packaged, canned, or something like that, 1 year past. So that's a way, maybe. It is.
And
it hasn't obviously been opened, but It's difficult.
Yeah, the daily, I think the most important thing is that, like, don't rely, if the yogurt looks and tastes and smells fine, and the date was yesterday, eat it. If you feel comfortable, don't like come sue me if anything. But some people will not, and again, I understand why, because you've been conditioned to believe that, like, this date means it's
Right.
it suddenly is, you know, it combusts after that date, but that's not the case. But we have to just, in absence of regulation, we do have to take some of the onus on ourselves to make sure that if something is good, we're not throwing it away. Yeah, but it's a good point. Okay, so the next thing, I wish in my dream world that if I could custom build my own refrigerator, the freezer would be much bigger than the refrigerator, because there's a lot you can do with your freezer. So if anything is destined to go bad, if you're going on vacation, if you see if you see some yogurt that actually looks like it's not going to be consumed, ate in, then actually stick it in your freezer. Yogurt freezes well. Most fruits and vegetables freeze really well. Use your freezer because it will keep food fresh. And then the other point to make about the freezer is if you're buying food, opt for frozen if you're not sure when you're going to use it. So frozen fruits and vegetables that are chopped are actually, most of them are flash frozen on site at the farm, which means they retain all their nutrients. Once food is picked, every day it's away from that kind of original source, it loses its nutrients, but when it's frozen, it retains pretty much most of the nutrients.
I learned a thing with freezing, like let's say if you get milk or something in a container, pour some out.
Yes.
And then
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely. Yes.
because
It expands, anything
yes,
expands when it's in the freezer, so definitely be careful of explosions in the freezer. And then the last point around reducing is actually learn the shelf life of different foods. So everything doesn't expire at the same time in terms of produce. Certain things actually spoil much more quickly than others, right? So if you look at what's in the 3 to 5 days, tomatoes are, you know, my favorite summertime food item, but oftentimes I have a green spot on it before I knew it. Whereas beets and carrots and cabbage and things like that actually last much longer. So just sort of be aware when you're doing your shop that certain things are going to go bad sooner than others.
It says printable on there. So if I go to the website, I can print that off?
Yeah, I can actually send this out to, I'll send it to Amanda, so you guys can print this out and leave it on your fridges.
One thing I've learned, apart from produce and so forth, like cheeses and so forth, honestly, if it's got a green spot on it or something like that, just cut that out.
Yeah, so cheese is actually one of those really kind of common misconceptions. Cheese actually stays good for a very, very long time if stored in some sort of airtight plastic container. And even if it's moldy, if it's a hard cheese, you cut off the moldy part. The rest of it's still good.
Right.
But again, you know, that's for the individuals.
So when my vegetables have been around too long,
Yes.
and I wouldn't actually want to eat them in a salad.
Yes.
Put them in a soup. They're
Yes.
still good in the soup,
Totally,
right?
totally. Yes, absolutely. Make stock with them. That's another great tip, yeah. So for reusing, this is definitely, we're going to get to this. So the first thing is around leftovers. A lot of people get a takeout container or doggy bag from a restaurant. The next day they're like, I just ate this. It's very easy to reinvent what's left over. If you have sauteed veggies, throw them in an omelet. If you have some meat left over and it's not enough to have a full entree, then put it in a sandwich. There's different ways to kind of reinvent what you already have consumed or prepared so it doesn't end up in the trash. My mom does this all the time where she'll have like a scrap of spinach left from the dinner night before and she'll stir fry it with some rice and then make veggie stir fry. Oh, another important tip around pizza, because I love pizza. So the best way to reheat pizza, this is a common misconception that you just stick it in the oven. No, you take it in an actual nonstick pan, you turn it on medium heat, you put a few drops of water on the bottom, turn the heat low, cover it with a lid, and it'll refluff. So there are ways to reinvent your
The
pizza.
water's on the bottom of the pan,
Yes,
you're saying?
yeah, just a few drops of it. The other point about, the parts that either are wilted or the parts that you would normally not want to use, leaves on from broccoli, stems from your cauliflower, all that stuff can actually be used. If you're talking about beet greens, these are just like regular salad greens. You can saute them and stick them with rice. If you have carrots that have the beautiful green tops on them, you can actually make pesto from that. And then if there are leftover parts, meat bones, stems, leaves from like the onion peels are actually great for making stock. So don't throw those away right away. And then reviving food. So this is your point about things that maybe you don't want to put in a salad. What do you actually do? Snacks Potato chips, things like that, you actually can re-crisp in the oven, put them in the oven for a few minutes on 350 degrees. If they tasted stale, they'll basically re-toast and taste pretty much close to fresh. Celery, you can cut off the bottoms if they're already wilted and stick them in a glass of water, similar to a bouquet of flowers. They will re-perk up. And then wilted salad greens, you can either throw them in a soup or you can actually immerse them in an ice water bath, and they typically perk back up.
If you,
Can I ask
if,
a
Yeah.
question about the previous slide?
Yes,
About using the vegetable peel.
yes.
I thought we had to peel them so we wouldn't eat the pesticide. So if you put them in the soup, aren't you getting the pesticide?
If you are trying to avoid pesticides and you're buying organic vegetables, then the peels are totally fine.
Right.
Or just wash really well and then use them. Yeah.
If you're washing for that vinegar,
Yeah. There's another question.
when you're making the stock,
Yes.
if you don't want to fiddle around with it, you can put it in your crock pot.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
It's,
Crock pot's great for that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
the best thing.
Yep. Yep. Okay, and then the last point I was going to make, because I know we're going to get into actual composting and I am not the expert, my solution for composting is storing everything in my freezer and then dumping it somewhere that will accept the compost. So what I used to do when I did not have a house and I had an apartment, I would take my frozen compost and I would dump it at a restaurant that let me dump it in their compost bin. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it now that I have an actual home that has yard waste collection is I will not put meat and dairy in my compost. That has to go in the landfill, but I'll take my regular kind of organic produce, food scraps, and they'll go in the yard waste bag. So that's a very easy solution, but it gets stored in the freezer during the week, and then the morning of I dump so we don't have a rodent problem. Or if you have a farmer that you happen to know at the farmer's market, you can always ask. I did have one farmer that was willing to take my compost when I would drop it off every week, I think at the Birmingham Farmer's Market, but that's not a consistent solution for everybody. Or you can compost at home, and I know we're going to get into what that actually looks like. So I think maybe it's best for me to turn it over to you as opposed to me trying to explain vermicomposting or anything like that.